there's a number most people have never thought about. It sits quietly, behind every breath, behind every flame, behind every rusting piece of iron left out in the rain. It is 21 the percentage of oxygen in the air right now. The air in the room you're sitting in, the air moving in and out of your lungs as you listen. That number has been roughly stable for 30 to 40 million years. It does not feel like a number. It feels like nothing at all, the way the ground feels like nothing until it shifts. Consider what it means for air to carry twice as much of any reactive gas. The modern atmosphere is not simply a background medium through which life moves. It is a participant in virtually every surface chemical reaction on the planet. It corrodes metal. It weathers rock. It fuels respiration and combustion alike. Every one of these processes is modulated by the concentration of oxygen, and every one would be running differently in an atmosphere with twice the current oxygen. The world is not just breathed by its inhabitants. It is chemically engaged with them, continuously, at every surface where air meets material. A 0% oxygen atmosphere is not simply richer air. It is more chemically aggressive air, air that reacts faster with everything it contacts, from the iron in exposed rock to the organic compounds in living tissue. This chemical aggressiveness is not, on its own, hostile to life. Life has always evolved in the presence of oxygen's reactivity, and the molecular machinery of living cells, the antioxidant enzymes, the repair mechanisms for oxidative damage, the compartmentalization that keeps reactive oxygen species away from sensitive molecules, is the product of billions of years of evolution in an oxygen-containing atmosphere. In a sustained high-oxygen world, that molecular machinery would be more elaborate, more robust, and more continuously engaged. The cellular biology of life at 40% oxygen is not poisoned life struggling against an excessive gas. It is life that has evolved over geological time to work with that gas rather than simply tolerate it. The origin of high oxygen on any planet is itself an interesting question. On Earth, the first significant rise in atmospheric oxygen, the Great Oxygenation Event, approximately 2.4 billion years ago, was produced by cyanobacteria, which evolved the ability to perform oxygenic photosynthesis and began releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Before this event, the atmosphere was essentially oxygen-free, and the organisms that existed had to manage without it. The rise of oxygen killed many of those organisms. For them, oxygen was toxic, but it opened the door to an entirely new metabolic pathway, aerobic respiration, that produces dramatically more energy per unit of fuel than the anaerobic alternatives. The organisms that could use oxygen outcompeted those that could not, and the biosphere reorganized around aerobic metabolism. A world at 40% oxygen has taken that organizational principle further. More oxygen in the atmosphere means a larger advantage for aerobic over anaerobic metabolism, means more vigorous and productive aerobic life, means more photosynthesis, means more biomass, means more potential for the high rates of organic carbon burial that the oxygen pulse requires. The high oxygen world is, in a sense, a world that has more fully committed to the oxygen-based biology that Earth began developing 2.4 billion years ago. A world further along the path that the Great Oxygenation Event started. The Carboniferous reached 30 to 35% and then came back down. What we are asking tonight goes further than that and does not come back down. We are asking what happens when the dial keeps turning, and the world has to find a new kind of stability around air that is permanently, geologically, irrevocably richer in oxygen than anything alive today has ever breathed. The Carboniferous period, which lasted from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago, saw atmospheric oxygen rise to somewhere between 30 and 35%, well above today's level, though not as high as the world we are imagining tonight. What happened during that interval is written in the fossil record. Insects that grew to the size of seagulls, trees of a kind that no longer exist, and evidence of fires that burned across forests on a scale that modern ecosystems have never experienced. The Carboniferous is the closest the Earth has come to the world we are about to examine, and it tells us a great deal about what higher oxygen makes possible and what it makes inevitable. What we will find is not simple. We will start in the atmosphere itself, in the chemistry of air under pressure, in what oxygen does to the surface of things when there is more of it. From there, we will move into the living world, into the bodies of insects and the roots of trees and the lungs of animals trying to breathe in a sky they were not built for. We will spend time with fire, which behaves very differently in this world, not occasionally and catastrophically, but continuously, as a permanent feature of the landscape. And we will follow the effects down into the ocean, into the carbon cycle, into the slow machinery that keeps a planet stable over millions of years. We do not know exactly what that world looks like, because it has never existed, not at this concentration, not for long enough to fully reorganize around it. But the physics is real. The biology is real. The Carboniferous happened. What we are doing tonight is following those real things as carefully as possible, past the point where the evidence runs out, and asking what comes next. Take your time with it. This world is strange and worth looking at slowly. To understand what doubling oxygen would mean, it helps to understand what oxygen is actually doing in the atmosphere right now, not in the vague sense of supporting life, which is true but imprecise, but in the specific, mechanistic sense of what oxygen does to the chemistry of the world at 21% concentration. Oxygen is a reactive molecule. This is one of those statements that sounds obvious. Everyone knows oxygen is involved in burning and breathing, but the full implications of oxygen's reactivity are less intuitive than they might seem. Oxygen does not simply sit in the atmosphere waiting to be breathed. It interacts continuously with the surfaces it contacts with rock, with water, with organic matter, with metals. It is, in a chemical sense, aggressive. The relative stability of the modern atmosphere is not a natural state for a planet to maintain indefinitely. It is an ongoing negotiation between the processes that produce oxygen, primarily photosynthesis, and the processes that consume it, primarily respiration, decomposition, and the weathering of rocks. The current 21% figure is the equilibrium point of that negotiation, as it has been running for the past several tens of millions of years. It is not the only equilibrium the planet has known. Over the history of complex life, the past 540 million years, atmospheric oxygen has varied substantially, falling as low as approximately 15% during the Triassic and Permian, and rising as high as 30 to 35% during the Carboniferous. The planet has tolerated a considerable range of oxygen concentrations and produced a considerable variety of ecosystems at different points along that range. What keeps oxygen at any given level is fundamentally a balance between sources and sinks. The primary source is photosynthesis, the process by which plants, algae, and cyanobacteria strip the oxygen from carbon dioxide and release it into the atmosphere while fixing the carbon into organic molecules. The primary sinks are respiration and decomposition, the processes by which organisms in the environment consume that oxygen, returning the carbon to its oxidized form. There is a subtlety here that is easy to miss. If all organic matter that was ever produced by photosynthesis were subsequently decomposed or eaten, the net effect on atmospheric oxygen would be zero. For the oxygen content of the atmosphere to rise, organic carbon has to be removed from the cycle buried in sediment before it can decompose, effectively locking the photosynthesis-derived oxygen into the atmosphere without the corresponding consumption. This is why coal and oil deposits matter for atmospheric oxygen. They represent buried organic carbon that was never decomposed, and their formation during the Carboniferous is closely linked to the high oxygen levels of that period. The tectonic and biological conditions that allow large-scale organic burial are therefore the conditions that elevate atmospheric oxygen. The Carboniferous was a period of extensive swamp forests, and the dead plant matter in those forests decomposed very slowly, partly because the organisms capable of breaking down lignin, the tough structural compound in wood, had not yet fully evolved at the start of the period. The result was an extraordinary accumulation of buried organic carbon, matched by an extraordinary accumulation of free oxygen in the atmosphere. Understanding this mechanism matters for tonight's thought experiment, because it tells us that a world with sustained 40% oxygen is not simply our world with more oxygen added. It is a world in which the organic carbon burial processes have been operating at an even higher rate than they did during the Carboniferous. A world in which the geological and biological conditions have conspired to maintain a level of atmospheric oxygen that has no direct precedent in Earth's history. The atmosphere at 40% oxygen would be different from ours in more ways than the oxygen concentration alone. The total pressure of the atmosphere would be slightly higher, since oxygen would be displacing nitrogen and other gases. The chemistry of the troposphere, the lowest layer of the atmosphere, where weather happens, would be significantly altered, with more reactive oxygen available to interact with water vapor, aerosols, and trace gases. The stratosphere, where ozone is produced from oxygen, would be thicker and more opaque to ultraviolet radiation, potentially providing stronger protection to surface life than the modern ozone layer does. These changes are not trivial. They set the stage for everything else that follows, for the fire, the giant life, the altered ocean, and the reorganized ecosystems that we will examine over the rest of this night's documentary. The air itself, in a 40% oxygen world, would be fundamentally different in character, not just richer in one gas, but chemically transformed in ways that ripple through every system that depends on atmospheric chemistry to function. Begin with the most immediate and the most dramatic consequence. What happens when you increase the oxygen content of the atmosphere by almost a factor of 2, and then something catches fire? There is also the question of what oxygen does to the chemistry of human physiology, which provides an indirect intuition for what a high oxygen world would mean for any oxygen-breathing organism. Pure oxygen, 100%, is toxic to humans at normal atmospheric pressure. Prolonged exposure causes pulmonary edema, seizures, and eventually death. The toxicity threshold drops as pressure rises. At higher total pressures, even modest oxygen concentrations become dangerous. At 40% oxygen and normal atmospheric pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen would be roughly double what we breathe today, high enough to begin causing oxidative stress in tissues over hours to days of continuous exposure. This is an important calibration. The animals of a 40% oxygen world would not be humans dropped into a different atmosphere. They would be organisms that had evolved over millions of years in that atmosphere, organisms whose antioxidant systems, their molecular defenses against the damage that oxygen causes at the cellular level, had been shaped by selection pressure in a high oxygen environment. The biochemistry of life in a high oxygen world is not simply the biochemistry of modern life under oxygen stress. It is a biochemistry that has adapted to that stress and found ways to use the additional oxygen productively rather than being overwhelmed by it. The fact that this adaptation is possible is demonstrated by the Carboniferous fauna itself. The giant dragonflies of Meganeura were not dying of oxygen toxicity. The millipede Arthropleura was not being poisoned by its atmosphere. They were living and reproducing in a 30 to 35% oxygen world, which means their cellular biology had accommodated the higher partial pressure without catastrophic consequences. Life, given sufficient time and selection pressure, finds ways to work with whatever atmosphere it inherits. This is perhaps the most reassuring aspect of the thought experiment from a biological standpoint. A 40% oxygen world is not simply a world of dead and poisoned animals. It is a world of animals that have evolved to use that oxygen to exploit its advantages for metabolism and aerobic capacity while managing its costs through sophisticated biochemical defense systems. The question is not whether life could survive at 40% oxygen, but what kind of life would thrive there, and what it would look like. The partial pressure of oxygen also affects the behavior of gases in solution in blood, in the fluid of the tracheal system, in the water of the ocean. At higher partial pressures, more oxygen dissolves into liquids. For organisms that use blood or hemolymph to transport oxygen, this means that the blood becomes more efficiently loaded with oxygen at any given ventilation rate. Organisms in a high oxygen world can, in principle, breathe less frequently to meet the same metabolic demand, or maintain the same breathing rate and sustain a higher metabolic rate. Either way, the respiratory system is working in an environment of greater abundance, which has consequences for the energetics of activity and the scaling of metabolic rates with body size. The atmosphere itself, at 40% oxygen, would also have a slightly different total pressure than the modern atmosphere, depending on what the nitrogen and other gas concentrations do. If oxygen simply displaces some nitrogen, which is the most straightforward scenario, the total pressure would be similar to today's, with the oxygen fraction doubled and the nitrogen fraction reduced proportionally. In this case, the total weight of the atmosphere and its pressure at the surface would be close to modern values, and organisms would not experience dramatically different mechanical effects from the air pressure itself. The change would be purely chemical, more oxygen per breath, with all the consequences that follow. This chemical richness of the air is the starting point for everything else. The fire, the giant bodies, the altered ocean, all of these flow from the single fact that the air contains twice as much of the reactive, energetic molecule that life and combustion both depend on. To understand any of the consequences, you have to start there, with the air richer and more reactive than the air we know, moving through a world that has had time to respond to it. Before following the thought experiment into territory that has no direct precedent, it is worth spending time in the place that comes closest, the Carboniferous period, which lasted from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago and produced the highest oxygen concentrations Earth has experienced in the age of complex life. The Carboniferous world was not recognizable as Earth in any immediate sense. The continents were arranged differently: Gondwana in the south, Laurussia in the north, the two supercontinents slowly converging toward the collision that would eventually produce Pangaea. The climate was, for much of the period, warm and humid, particularly in the equatorial regions where the great coal-forming forests grew. There was no grass. Grass would not evolve for another 200 million years. There were no flowering plants. The dominant vegetation was a combination of tree-sized ferns, giant horsetails reaching 30 meters in height, and lycopsid trees, the ancestors of today's tiny club mosses that grew to heights of 50 meters and diameters of 2 meters, covering vast, swampy lowlands in dense, towering forests unlike anything alive today. These forests were the engine of the Carboniferous oxygen pulse. They grew in prodigious quantities, fixing carbon from the atmosphere into their massive trunks and root systems. When they died, they fell into the waterlogged swamps and decomposed extremely slowly, or, in many cases, did not decompose at all. The critical factor was the absence of organisms capable of efficiently breaking down lignin, the compound that gives wood its structural rigidity. Lignin had evolved relatively recently at the start of the Carboniferous, and the fungi and bacteria that could digest it had not yet caught up. The dead wood of the Carboniferous forests accumulated in layers, compressed over millions of years into the coal deposits that powered the Industrial Revolution 300 million years later. Each ton of coal buried was, in effect, a release of oxygen into the atmosphere. The carbon had been extracted from carbon dioxide by photosynthesis. The oxygen had been released, and then the carbon was taken out of circulation before anything could oxidize it back. Over tens of millions of years of this process, operating across vast swampy forest systems spanning much of the tropical landmass, the oxygen content of the atmosphere climbed to levels estimated between 30 and 35%. The consequences were visible in the fossil record, in ways that are still arresting today. The most famous consequence is the giant insects. The Carboniferous and the immediately following Permian period produced arthropods of a scale that seems almost impossible by modern standards. Meganeura, a dragonfly-like insect, had a wingspan of approximately 70 centimeters wider than a modern crow. Arthropleura, a millipede relative, reached lengths of approximately 2.5 meters, making it the largest known land invertebrate in Earth's history. The scorpions and cockroaches of the Carboniferous were larger than their modern descendants by significant margins. The connection between high oxygen and giant insect size is not entirely straightforward, and it has been the subject of genuine scientific debate. Insects breathe through a passive system of tubes called tracheae hollow tubes that carry oxygen directly to the tissues through a branching network, without the involvement of a circulatory system in the way that vertebrate lungs work. This system is efficient at small sizes, but becomes increasingly limiting as body size increases, because the tubes must become longer and thicker to reach more distant tissues, and the passive diffusion of oxygen through them becomes progressively less effective at larger scales. At higher atmospheric oxygen concentrations, however, the gradient driving oxygen diffusion into the tracheal system is steeper. Oxygen moves faster and further down the tubes. The limiting factor on insect size, the inability to deliver sufficient oxygen to large bodies through passive diffusion, is partially relaxed. The consequence, over millions of years of evolution, was the production of insects substantially larger than anything the tracheal system could sustain at 21% oxygen. The evidence for this mechanism goes beyond the correlation between high oxygen and large insects in the Carboniferous. Researchers have found that insect body sizes track atmospheric oxygen across the geological record, with some consistency decreasing during low oxygen intervals in the Triassic and Permian, increasing during the Carboniferous high, and declining again as oxygen returned to lower levels. The relationship is not perfect, and other factors, predation, pressure, climate, competition, also influence insect size. But the oxygen correlation is robust enough that most researchers accept some version of the tracheal limitation hypothesis. The Carboniferous world also showed evidence of elevated fire activity, which is one of the most important signals for understanding what a higher oxygen world looks like. Charcoal, the signature residue of ancient fire, appears in Carboniferous sediments at higher concentrations than in most other geological periods. The charcoal record suggests that fires burned more frequently and more intensely during the Carboniferous than during lower oxygen periods, consistent with the prediction that higher oxygen makes combustion easier and more persistent. This is a crucial piece of evidence for tonight's thought experiment. If 30 to 35% oxygen already produced a measurably more fire-prone world than the one we inhabit, a world at 40% oxygen would push the fire problem significantly further. The Carboniferous gives us a calibration point, a real-world demonstration of what elevated oxygen does to the incidence and behavior of fire, and it suggests that the consequences at even higher oxygen would be qualitatively different, not just quantitatively more severe. It is worth examining the Carboniferous fossil record in somewhat more detail, because the specific organisms it contains tell us things about what high oxygen enables that are not obvious from the headline statistics. The giant millipede Arthropleura is perhaps the most viscerally striking of the Carboniferous giants, and studying it carefully reveals something about how high oxygen changes the constraints on life. Arthropleura was an herbivore, the largest land herbivore of its time, consuming the dense vegetation of the Carboniferous coal swamps. Its exoskeleton has been recovered in fragments from multiple sites in Europe and North America, and the reconstruction of its maximum size, up to 2.5 meters in length, is based on the scaling relationships of these fragments. What is notable about Arthropleura is not just its size, but what its size implies about the ecosystem it inhabited. A 2.5-meter herbivorous arthropod requires an enormous quantity of plant material to sustain itself. The Carboniferous coal swamps clearly provided that the great lycopsid forests and the dense fern understories of the swamp floor produced biomass at rates that could support megaherbivores of a kind that the post-Carboniferous world, at lower oxygen, could not. The giant herbivore was an ecological consequence of the giant plant productivity, and the giant plant productivity was itself a consequence of the warm, humid, high carbon dioxide conditions of the Carboniferous tropics, combined with the atmospheric oxygen that those very plants were producing. The predators of the Carboniferous high oxygen world are also notable. The giant dragonflies of Meganeura were aerial predators, the apex predators of the Carboniferous air. A dragonfly with a 70-centimeter wingspan is not a small hunting machine. It is a formidable one, capable of capturing prey much larger than any modern dragonfly can manage. The Carboniferous record contains evidence of scorpions that were significantly larger than their modern relatives. And while scorpions were probably not the apex predators of the period, that role belonged to the large amphibians and early reptiles that also inhabited the swamp margins. Their scale in a high-oxygen environment suggests that even the secondary predators of an elevated oxygen world are of a different order from their descendants. The transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian is itself instructive for our thought experiment, because it represents a natural experiment in what happens when high oxygen begins to decline. The Carboniferous coal swamp forests did not disappear instantaneously. They fragmented over millions of years as the climate dried and the great lowland swamps became discontinuous and eventually largely disappeared. During this fragmentation, the oxygen level began to fall, and the large arthropods began to decline. The giant millipedes disappeared. The large flying insects became less common. The diversity of giant-scale arthropod forms contracted. This is not a simple story of cause and effect climate change. Predation from the increasingly successful reptiles and amphibians, and competition for resources all played roles in the decline of the Carboniferous megafauna. But the correlation with declining oxygen is consistent and suggestive. The world at 30 to 35% oxygen was the world of giant arthropods. The world at 25% oxygen, which prevailed through much of the Permian, was a world in which the ecological dominance of large arthropods had been substantially reduced. The oxygen and the giants declined together. In a world that maintained 40% oxygen, that decline would not have happened. The world of the giant arthropods would have been sustained and given millions of years of additional evolution in a high-oxygen environment. Those arthropods would have continued to diversify, to explore the ecological possibilities of their scale, and to produce forms that the brief Carboniferous high never had the time to generate. The giant millipede's 2.5 meters would not have been the upper limit. It would have been a starting point for further exploration of what a large, armored, multi-legged body plan can become when it is not constrained by oxygen availability. The Carboniferous also produced the world's first amniotes organisms that lay eggs that can develop outside of water, which freed vertebrate reproduction from dependence on aquatic environments. The early amniotes were small, roughly the size of modern lizards, and they lived in the margins of the great coal swamp forests. In a sustained high-oxygen world, these organisms would have had the same metabolic advantages as their arthropod contemporaries: more oxygen per breath, wider aerobic scope, the ability to sustain higher activity levels. Their radiation into the ecological space vacated by or alongside the giant arthropods would have produced a vertebrate fauna that was, from its earliest stages, shaped by oxygen abundance in ways that the actual vertebrate lineage was not. The animals we know, the reptiles, the mammals, the birds are the descendants of organisms that evolved through multiple low-oxygen intervals, through the near-total devastation of the Permian-Triassic extinction, through the recovery under whatever atmospheric conditions prevailed in the Triassic. They were shaped by constraint as much as by abundance. The vertebrates of a sustained high-oxygen world would have been shaped by a different set of constraints, by the fire ecology, by the available prey, by the competition with giant arthropods, and the result would bear only a partial resemblance to the vertebrate lineages we know. The Carboniferous ended as oxygen levels peaked and then began to decline, driven partly by the spread of lignin-decomposing fungi, which slowly began to catch up with the accumulated dead wood and return its carbon to the atmosphere, and partly by the changing geological and climatic conditions of the late Carboniferous and Permian. The great swamp forests retreated, fragmented, and eventually gave way to drier environments. The oxygen pulse ended, the giant insects declined, the charcoal record thinned. The world we are imagining tonight is one where those declines never happened, where the conditions that drove the oxygen rise continued to operate, and the atmosphere kept climbing past 35% toward 40 and beyond. It is a world that the Carboniferous pointed toward and then stepped back from. Tonight, we follow where it might have gone. Fire, at its most basic, is a rapid chemical reaction between oxygen and a fuel, a self-sustaining process in which the heat released by the oxidation of the fuel is sufficient to sustain further oxidation, producing more heat, which sustains more reaction, until the fuel or the oxygen is exhausted. Every aspect of fire, how easily it ignites, how hot it burns, how rapidly it spreads, what it can consume is influenced by the concentration of oxygen available to it. At 21% oxygen, fire is a familiar and manageable phenomenon. Dry wood ignites at roughly 250 to 300 degrees Celsius. Fires spread at rates determined by wind, fuel load, and moisture content. Green vegetation, living plant matter with high water content does not easily ignite. Fires need conditions to be unusually dry and hot before they can sustain themselves in most landscapes. As oxygen concentration rises, these thresholds change in ways that become increasingly significant. Experiments with simulated high oxygen atmospheres have shown that ignition temperatures drop as oxygen concentration increases. Fuel that requires high temperatures to ignite at 21%. Oxygen will ignite at lower temperatures as oxygen rises. The rate of flame spread increases. The minimum moisture content at which vegetation can burn decreases, meaning that green, living plant matter becomes a viable fuel at higher oxygen levels rather than the fire-resistant barrier it represents in the modern world. At 30 to 35% oxygen, the Carboniferous maximum, the evidence suggests that fires burned more readily and more extensively than today, but that some level of self-regulation was in place. If fires burned the forests, they removed the fuel. If the fuel was removed, the fires could not continue. A balance of sorts was maintained, though at a higher intensity than the modern world experiences. At 40% oxygen, the fire problem enters a different regime. Laboratory experiments and computational models suggest that at oxygen concentrations above 35%, even damp plant matter can sustain combustion. The minimum moisture content required for ignition drops to levels that living plants regularly experience, meaning that in a 40% oxygen world, fires would not need to wait for drought conditions. They would ignite in conditions that our eyes would categorize as green and healthy landscape. A lightning strike in a humid tropical forest would have a meaningful probability of producing a fire that spreads through the canopy. The implications for the structure of terrestrial ecosystems are significant. In a world where fire can ignite under almost any weather condition and spread through living vegetation, the evolutionary pressure on plants would be intense and unrelenting. Plants that survive in such a world are not the plants we know. They would be plants that have evolved over millions of years of selection pressure in a high oxygen, high fire environment. Strategies for resisting, surviving, or exploiting fire that go far beyond anything in the modern flora. Some of those strategies are visible in the modern world. in fire-adapted ecosystems like the Australian bushland or the African savanna, bark that insulates the living cambium from heat, seeds that require fire to germinate serotinous cones that open only after exposure to high temperatures, deep root systems that allow rapid resprouting after above-ground structures are burned, underground storage organs that survive fire by virtue of being below ground, in a 40% oxygen world. These adaptations would not be specializations of unusual fire-prone habitats. They would be the baseline requirement for survival in almost any terrestrial environment. The plants that filled the world's forests and grasslands would be, effectively, fire plants, organisms whose entire life history had been shaped by the assumption that fire was not an occasional catastrophe, but a near-constant condition of existence. This has cascading consequences for the animals that depend on plants. Herbivores in a high-oxygen, high-fire world cannot rely on continuous vegetation cover. The landscape would be more patchy areas of dense vegetation, alternating with recently burned zones at various stages of recovery. The animals that thrive in such an environment would be those capable of moving across a heterogeneous landscape, finding food in recently burned areas where fresh growth emerges quickly, avoiding the hottest and most fire-prone zones, and surviving periods of intense fire activity in refugia rivers, rocky outcrops, areas with naturally lower fuel loads. The fire problem also has implications for the carbon cycle. Modern wildfires release stored carbon from vegetation back into the atmosphere, temporarily converting fixed organic carbon back into carbon dioxide. In a world where fires are dramatically more frequent and intense, the rate of this carbon return would be much higher. This would create a negative feedback on the oxygen-carbon dioxide system. More fire means more carbon dioxide released, which eventually reduces the oxygen-producing advantage of photosynthesis. This feedback is one of the reasons that atmospheric oxygen has never, in the geological record, remained at extremely high levels for long periods. The fire-driven carbon return is part of what eventually brings oxygen back down. But the feedback operates on geological timescales millions of years, not years or decades. In the interim, a world at 40% oxygen would be a world in which fire had reorganized the land surface in fundamental ways. Not a world reduced to ash. The vegetation would recover, and the high oxygen that drove the fires would also support abundant plant growth, but a world where the relationship between living things and fire was entirely different from anything in the modern experience. The animals in this world would know fire the way modern animals in high-latitude environments know winter as a regular, expected, structuring feature of the environment, one that shapes behavior, seasonal rhythms, and evolutionary strategy. Not as an aberration, as a condition, the ecological structure of fire in a high-oxygen world deserves more careful examination, because fire is not simply a destructive force. In the modern world, fire is an ecological process, one that releases nutrients locked in plant biomass, that creates opportunities for fast-growing pioneer species, that maintains the diversity of fire-adapted landscapes by preventing any single competitive dominant from taking over. Fire is a part of the ecology of savanna, chaparral, boreal forest, and Mediterranean shrubland. It is managed by many indigenous human cultures as a tool for maintaining landscape structure. It is, in a real sense, a partner in the ecology of these systems. In a 40% oxygen world, fire would be an even more fundamental ecological partner, not just a part of certain specialized ecosystems, but a structuring force in most terrestrial environments. The frequency of fire in any given landscape would be higher, the intensity would be greater, and the recovery period between fires would be shorter because fire-adapted plant communities, given sufficient time to evolve under these conditions, would be capable of very rapid regrowth. The relationship between fire frequency and plant community structure is one of the most studied topics in fire ecology. In modern fire-adapted ecosystems, The interval between fires is a key determinant of which species dominate. Short fire intervals favor fast-growing, fire-resistant species with the ability to resprout rapidly after burning. Longer intervals allow slower-growing, but more competitive species to establish before the next fire clears the ground again. The structure of modern fire-adapted landscapes is a product of the specific fire regimes they have experienced over evolutionary time. In a high-oxygen world, the fire interval would be shorter almost everywhere. The evolutionary consequence would be the dominance of fire-adapted strategies at a global scale, not just in the environments where fire is currently common, but in most terrestrial ecosystems. The tropical rainforest of a 4.0% oxygen world would be unrecognizable compared to a modern tropical rainforest. It would be more open, with more fire-resistant bark, more underground storage organs, more serotinous seed strategies. The canopy, rather than being a continuous closed cover of shade-tolerant species, would be interrupted by frequent gaps created by fires that, in the modern rainforest, would almost never occur. This openness would have profound consequences for the animals that inhabit these environments. Modern closed canopy tropical rainforests support a particular suite of adaptations: specialized tree climbing strategies, adaptations for life in low-light conditions, complex, three-dimensional habitat use. In a more open, fire-interrupted landscape, the premium on these specialized strategies would be reduced. Animals that can move across more open terrain, that can exploit the flush of growth that follows a fire, that can navigate a landscape of varying burn histories, these would be the ecological generalists of a high-oxygen world. The insects in particular would show striking adaptations to the fire environment. Modern fire beetles of the genus Melanophila are attracted to forest fires by infrared sensors. They detect the heat of burning wood from distances of dozens of kilometers and fly into the fire zone to lay their eggs in freshly burned wood. In a world where fires are more frequent and cover more area, insects with this ecological strategy, exploitation of fire as a resource, rather than avoidance of it as a hazard, would be enormously successful. Fire-following ecology, which is a specialized niche in the modern world, would be a mainstream strategy in a high-oxygen world, and the variety of organisms that exploit the post-fire environment would be dramatically higher. The smoke chemistry of a high-oxygen world also deserves a brief note. Fire produces a complex mixture of combustion products: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter. In a world where fires are more frequent and more intense, the chemical composition of the lower atmosphere would be significantly affected by the continuous presence of fire-derived compounds. The ecology of the atmosphere, the chemistry that determines what compounds are present in the air, at what concentrations, and with what biological effects would be different in ways that interact with the oxygen itself and with the photosynthesis and respiration of the organisms below. None of this makes the high-oxygen world uninhabitable. It makes it different, shaped by fire in the way that the modern world is shaped by water, with entire ecological structures built around the assumption that fire is a constant, predictable feature of the environment. The organisms that filled this world would be, in their own way, as thoroughly adapted to their conditions as modern organisms are to ours. There is one more aspect of the fire problem that deserves attention before we move on: what the fires would look like. At 40% oxygen, flames burn hotter and brighter than at 21%. The same fuel load produces a more intense flame, with higher temperatures and a more rapid rate of energy release. The sky above an active fire zone in a high-oxygen world would be more intensely lit, the glow visible at greater distances, the column of smoke and flame rising higher into the atmosphere. Lightning-triggered fires in the dry season of a high-oxygen world would produce events of an intensity that modern wildfires only approach under the most extreme conditions. This is not a world on fire in the sense of total destruction. It is a world more thoroughly shaped by fire, than any landscape we know, a world in which fire is ecological infrastructure, as fundamental to the landscape as rivers or soil. The question of animal size in a high-oxygen world is one of the most immediately compelling aspects of the thought experiment, because the Carboniferous already gave us a preview, and the preview was arresting. Giant dragonflies, meter-long millipedes, scorpions the size of large dogs. The question for a 0% oxygen world is where that scaling continues to go, and which groups of animals it affects most. The answer depends on physiology, because the relationship between oxygen and body size is not the same for all animal groups. It is most direct and most dramatic for insects and other arthropods, whose tracheal breathing system is the one most constrained by oxygen availability. For vertebrates, the relationship is more complex, and the effects, while real, are less dramatically size-determining. Begin with the arthropods, because they make the most striking case. The tracheal system of insects is, as discussed in the previous chapter, a passive diffusion system. Oxygen moves into the body through spiracles, small openings along the body wall, and travels through a branching network of tubes to reach individual tissues. The efficiency of this system falls off rapidly with increasing body size, because the diffusion pathway becomes longer and the surface area available for gas exchange does not scale proportionally with the volume of tissue that needs to be served. At 21% oxygen, the upper limit of insect size imposed by tracheal limitations is somewhere in the range of the largest modern insects, the Goliath beetles, and certain tropical moths, which reach masses of 50 to 100 grams and wingspans of up to 30 centimeters. At 30 to 35% oxygen, as the Carboniferous demonstrates, those limits shift upward significantly. The Meganeura dragonfly at 70 centimeter wingspan, the Arthropleura millipede at 2.5 meters length. At 40% oxygen, the tracheal limitation is further relaxed, and the question becomes what else limits arthropod size. The structural limitation of the exoskeleton, the fact that an exoskeleton must increase in mass disproportionately with body size to maintain structural integrity, becomes relevant at very large scales. The mechanical requirements of locomotion place constraints on how large a jointed, legged body plan can become, and the ecological requirements, what the animal eats, what eats it, how it reproduces, are not simply removed by increasing oxygen. Nevertheless, the arthropods of a sustained 0% oxygen world would be substantially larger than anything that lived during the Carboniferous. Dragonfly analogues with wingspans approaching or exceeding a meter. Myriapods, the millipede and centipede relatives at scales approaching or exceeding 3 to 4 meters. Aquatic arthropods, which have the additional support of buoyancy and therefore face somewhat different size constraints, potentially larger still. These are not pleasant creatures to contemplate, and the effect of imagining them is immediate and visceral in a way that the thought experiment often is not. But they are a reasonable extrapolation from what the fossil record shows us about the relationship between oxygen and arthropod size. For vertebrates, the picture is more nuanced. Vertebrates breathe with lungs, a centralized organ that exchanges gas with the blood, which then carries oxygen to the tissues. The lung system scales much more effectively with body size than the tracheal system does. As a result, vertebrate size is not primarily limited by oxygen availability in the way that insect size is. Large vertebrates, the sauropod dinosaurs, the blue whale, achieve their size under oxygen concentrations close to or even lower than modern levels. What higher oxygen does for vertebrates is not so much remove a size ceiling as change the metabolic possibilities available at any given size. At higher oxygen concentrations, aerobic metabolism, the oxygen-consuming form of metabolism that produces the most energy per unit of fuel, becomes more efficient. Animals can sustain higher metabolic rates for longer periods. They can recover from intense exercise more quickly. The aerobic scope, the range of metabolic rates an animal can sustain, widens. The consequence of this for vertebrates is not primarily a scaling of maximum size, but a change in the ecological possibilities available at large sizes. In the modern world, very large animals tend to be constrained in their activity levels by the metabolic cost of being large. They move more slowly, rest more, and are less capable of sustained high-intensity activity than smaller animals. In a high-oxygen world, the metabolic tax on large size is lower. Large vertebrates could sustain higher activity levels, cover more ground, and exploit resources more efficiently than equivalently sized modern animals. This would push the ceiling of viable ecological strategies available to large body plans. An animal the size of a large elephant, operating in a 40% oxygen world, would not behave the way a modern elephant does. It would be more active, more wide-ranging, and capable of physiological feats: sustained running, extended breath-holding, rapid recovery from exertion that modern megafauna cannot match. The birds are a particularly interesting case. Modern birds already have the most efficient respiratory system of any land vertebrate. Their flow-through lung design, combined with a complex system of air sacs, allows them to extract oxygen from air more effectively than mammalian lungs do. In a high-oxygen world, that efficiency advantage would be even more pronounced. The aerodynamic possibilities for large birds expand as oxygen availability increases, because sustained powered flight is metabolically expensive. At 40% oxygen, the size range over which powered flight is metabolically viable for birds would be larger. The upper limit of bird size, currently constrained in large part by the metabolic cost of sustained flight, would shift upward. The world's largest flying birds would be substantially larger than the condors and albatrosses that currently hold the record. The implications of high oxygen for reproduction and development in large animals are worth examining, because they reveal a less obvious way that increased oxygen availability reshapes the possibilities of life. For organisms with internal fertilization and live birth, the mammals, in particular the developing embryo, is a special case of the oxygen size problem. Embryos receive oxygen through the placenta from the maternal circulation, and the rate of oxygen delivery sets limits on how rapidly an embryo can grow and how metabolically active it can be during development. At higher maternal blood oxygen saturation, which would be a consequence of the higher atmospheric oxygen partial pressure, oxygen delivery to the embryo would be enhanced. Gestation times for large mammals might be shorter in a high-oxygen world, or if gestation times were maintained, the metabolic activity of the developing embryo could be higher, potentially allowing for more complete neural and physiological development before birth. For egg-laying animals, birds, reptiles, and the monotremes among mammals, oxygen reaches the developing embryo through pores in the eggshell by passive diffusion from the surrounding air. The rate of oxygen delivery to the embryo is therefore directly influenced by atmospheric oxygen partial pressure. At higher oxygen concentrations, the gradient driving oxygen diffusion into the egg is steeper, and embryos receive more oxygen per unit of time at the same shell porosity. This could allow eggs to be larger embryos, with more tissues requiring oxygen, would be viable at egg sizes that would be oxygen limited under current atmospheric conditions. Alternatively, it could allow eggs to develop more rapidly, since the metabolic processes that transform a fertilized cell into a hatching organism could proceed faster when oxygen is more abundant. The consequence for birds is particularly interesting. Modern birds are limited in egg size in part because the oxygen requirements of a large embryo cannot be met through the shell. At the current atmospheric oxygen level, the shell would need to be more porous, which would compromise the structural integrity of the egg or allow excessive water loss. In a high-oxygen world, larger eggs are viable. Larger eggs produce larger chicks. Larger chicks can eventually grow into larger adults. The maximum body size of birds, which is constrained by the metabolic demands of powered flight and the limitations of the respiratory and circulatory systems, would shift upward in a world where oxygen is more abundant. The same logic applies to the giant reptiles of various periods in Earth's history. and to the insects. The Carboniferous giant arthropods were not just larger in body, they were producing larger eggs, with embryos that developed in air at 30 to 35% oxygen, and that therefore had access to the oxygen they needed to complete development at their unusual size. At 40% oxygen, the eggs of insect analogs could be larger still, and the time required for development could be shorter, or the complexity of the organism that develops could be greater. This developmental dimension of the oxygen question is one of the least discussed but potentially most important aspects of what a high-oxygen world would look like. It is not just that adult organisms can be larger. It is that the entire developmental trajectory from fertilized cell to juvenile to adult runs under different constraints, with different possibilities for what can be built in the time available between fertilization and hatching or birth. Life in a high-oxygen world is not just adults scaling up. It is a complete reshaping of the developmental biology of every oxygen-breathing organism from the moment of conception. The nervous system is another area where higher oxygen availability during development and throughout adult life would have consequences. Neural tissue is among the most metabolically expensive tissue in the animal body, the human brain, which makes up roughly 2% of body mass, consumes roughly 20% of the body's oxygen. The metabolic cost of large, complex brains is one of the constraints that shapes the evolution of neural complexity organisms, with large brains need reliable, high-rate oxygen delivery to sustain them. In a high-oxygen world, that constraint is relaxed. The oxygen cost of large neural tissue is met more easily. The selective pressure against metabolically expensive brains is reduced. This does not guarantee that a high-oxygen world would produce more intelligent organisms. Intelligence is shaped by many factors, and oxygen availability is only one of them. But the metabolic cost of intelligence is lower in a high-oxygen world, which means that the threshold for intelligence being worth its cost, from an evolutionary standpoint, is lower. Complex nervous systems, on average, might be more prevalent in a high-oxygen biosphere than in our own. Trees, too, would be larger. The height of trees is limited, in part, by the mechanical challenge of lifting water from the soil to the canopy against gravity. The taller the tree, the greater the tension that must be generated in the water-conducting xylem vessels. But tree height is also influenced by the rate of photosynthesis and carbon fixation, which in turn influences how fast a tree can grow its structural support. At higher atmospheric oxygen, the water use efficiency of photosynthesis changes the ratio of carbon fixed to water transpired shifts, with implications for how trees manage the competing demands of gas exchange and water conservation. The result, over evolutionary time, would likely be trees that are both taller and more structurally robust than the largest trees alive today. Organisms that push the physical limits of woody stem architecture in ways that the Carboniferous lycopsids only began to approach. The question of flight in a high-oxygen world has received significant scientific attention, in part because the Carboniferous giant dragonflies raise an interesting problem. How could they fly at all? Modern dragonflies are highly efficient flyers. Their wing design and flight musculature are among the most aerodynamically sophisticated in the insect world. But scaling a dragonfly up to 70-centimeter wingspan creates aerodynamic challenges that are not simply solved by making the wings larger and the muscles bigger. The mass of the animal increases as the cube of its linear dimensions, while the wing area increases only as the square. At some point, the wing loading the mass per unit of wing area becomes so high that sustained flight requires unreasonably powerful muscles. One proposed solution is that the Carboniferous atmosphere, which was not only higher in oxygen but also denser than the modern atmosphere due to higher concentrations of certain gases, provided more aerodynamic lift per unit of wing area. Denser air is more effective at generating lift, which partially compensates for the higher wing loading of larger insects. This is one of several hypotheses for how Carboniferous giant insects could fly, and it is not fully resolved. In a 40% oxygen world, the atmosphere might be slightly denser than the modern one, depending on the nitrogen concentration. If the oxygen has partially displaced nitrogen, the total atmospheric mass would be similar to today's, and the density would be close to modern values. If other changes in the atmosphere have increased its total mass, the density could be higher. The aerodynamics of flight in a high-oxygen world therefore depend on details of atmospheric composition beyond the oxygen concentration alone. What can be said with confidence is that the metabolic cost of powered flight at a given size is lower in a higher oxygen atmosphere, because the aerobic metabolism that powers flight muscles is more efficient when oxygen is more abundant. Large flying insects that would be metabolically unsustainable at 21% oxygen could sustain their flight musculature more easily at 40%. The aerodynamic challenge of flying at large size is real, but the metabolic challenge is reduced, which shifts the balance toward larger feasible flying insects, even if the aerodynamic constraints impose limits that pure metabolism alone does not. The practical upper limit on insect flight in a high-oxygen world is genuinely unknown. It would depend on the specific aerodynamic solutions that evolution found, the atmospheric density, and the ecological pressures that shaped flying insect evolution in that world. But a reasonable expectation is that the largest flying insects of a sustained 40% oxygen world would substantially exceed the 70-centimeter wingspan of Meganeura, the Carboniferous maximum, by a significant margin. The ecology of a 40% oxygen world, seen from this perspective, is not simply scaled up from our own. It is restructured with different size distributions, different metabolic rates, different possibilities for what bodies can do and where they can go. It is a world where the large end of the size spectrum is more populated, more active, and more ecologically dominant than in the world we know. And it is a world where the relationships between predator and prey, between plant and herbivore, between the landscape and the organisms that inhabit it, are all running on different parameters. The terrestrial consequences of doubled atmospheric oxygen tend to dominate discussions of this thought experiment because they are visually dramatic. The giant insects, the permanent fires, the altered forests are easy to picture and difficult to ignore. But the ocean would also be profoundly changed by a 40% oxygen atmosphere, and in ways that are, if anything, more consequential for the overall habitability of the planet. The ocean and the atmosphere are not separate systems. They exchange gases continuously at the air-sea interface, and the partial pressures of gases dissolved in surface seawater are in equilibrium with the partial pressures of those gases in the atmosphere above. An atmosphere with twice the oxygen of the modern world would dissolve twice as much oxygen into the surface ocean, and that additional dissolved oxygen would have consequences that ripple through the entire marine system. Begin with the most immediate benefit, the oxygenation of the deep ocean. The modern deep ocean is poorly oxygenated. Oxygen enters the ocean at the surface, where it is produced by phytoplankton and absorbed from the atmosphere. It is consumed by the respiration and decomposition of organic matter as material sinks from the surface into deep water. The circulation of the ocean, the thermohaline circulation that moves water from the surface to the deep and back again, is slow. A complete cycle takes approximately 1,000 to 2,000 years. During that circulation time, oxygen is progressively depleted from the deep water by the constant rain of organic materials sinking from above. In the modern ocean, much of the deep water below 1,000 meters is severely oxygen depleted, not quite anoxic in most places, but low enough that the diversity and abundance of life it supports is dramatically lower than in surface waters. There are regions, oxygen minimum zones, where the oxygen depletion is severe enough to exclude most multicellular life entirely. In a 40% oxygen atmosphere, the oxygen content of surface water would be substantially higher. The starting concentration for the downward circulation would be elevated, meaning that even after the slow depletion during the 1,000 to 2,000 year circulation time, the deep water would arrive at depth with more oxygen than it does today. Oxygen minimum zones would shrink in many basins, potentially disappearing entirely. The deep ocean would become, for the first time in the planet's history, a genuinely well-oxygenated environment from surface to bottom. The consequences for marine life would be significant. The deep ocean is not empty. It is inhabited by a remarkable variety of organisms adapted to darkness, cold, and low oxygen conditions. But the fauna of the modern deep ocean is sparse by surface standards, and the diversity of multicellular life decreases dramatically with depth. A well-oxygenated deep ocean would open up an enormous volume of habitable space to organisms that currently cannot exploit it. The deep sea floor, which covers most of the ocean's area, would become accessible to active, oxygen-demanding organisms in a way that it currently is not. This would likely produce a radiation of deep-sea life, a diversification of organisms, exploiting newly available ecological space that would transform the composition and structure of the marine biosphere. The deep ocean, in the modern world, is one of the least biologically productive environments on Earth. In a high-oxygen world, it could become one of the most productive, a vast, cold, dark, but oxygen-rich environment supporting complex food webs built on the rain of organic matter from above. There is a complication, however. The relationship between oxygen and ocean chemistry is not linear, and higher dissolved oxygen in the ocean creates its own chemical changes that are not uniformly beneficial. Oxygen is a strong oxidant. At higher concentrations, it promotes the oxidation of dissolved organic carbon and other reduced compounds in seawater. This can affect the chemistry of nutrients, particularly iron and phosphorus, which are essential for phytoplankton growth and which behave differently under different oxidation conditions. Iron, in particular, is highly sensitive to redox conditions. In oxidizing conditions, iron forms insoluble hydroxides and precipitates out of solution, making it unavailable to phytoplankton. In reducing conditions, iron remains dissolved and biologically available. The modern ocean is already iron-limited in large areas. The Southern Ocean, the Equatorial Pacific, and the Subarctic Pacific are all iron-limited regions where phytoplankton production is constrained not by light or macronutrients, but by the scarcity of dissolved iron. In a higher oxygen ocean, this iron limitation could be more widespread, suppressing phytoplankton productivity in regions that currently support substantial primary production. This creates a tension at the heart of the high oxygen ocean. Better oxygenated deep water and more habitable deep sea environments on one hand, and potentially reduced surface productivity on the other. The net effect on marine biological diversity would depend on the balance between these competing influences, a balance that would play out differently in different ocean basins, at different latitudes, and under different patterns of ocean circulation. The marine arthropods of a high-oxygen world deserve specific attention because the ocean offers additional possibilities for arthropod gigantism that the land does not. On land, the weight of a large body is supported by the skeleton, and for arthropods, the exoskeleton's mass increases as a cube of linear dimension, meaning that at very large sizes, the exoskeleton itself becomes the main metabolic and structural burden. The largest land arthropods alive today, the coconut crab, at a few kilograms, are close to the practical upper limit imposed by the structural and metabolic costs of a large exoskeleton on land. In water, buoyancy partially offsets the weight of the body and the exoskeleton, reducing the structural load the skeleton must bear. Marine arthropods can therefore be larger than their terrestrial relatives under the same oxygen conditions. The fossil record confirms this. The largest arthropods in Earth's history were the Eurypterids, which were aquatic, and they reached lengths of approximately 2.5 meters, with the largest specimens of Jaclopterus rhinaniae estimated at up to 2.6 meters. In a 4.0% 4% oxygen world, the dissolved oxygen content of the surface ocean would be roughly double current levels. The tracheal system is not relevant to marine arthropods. They breathe through gills, which extract dissolved oxygen from the water. But the principle is the same. At higher dissolved oxygen concentrations, the gill surface area required to meet the respiratory demands of a given body size is smaller, and the maximum body size that the gill system can sustain at a given level of activity is larger. Marine arthropods in a 40% oxygen world could therefore exceed the eurypterid maximum by a significant margin. Crustacean analogues, shrimp-like and lobster-like organisms, with the body plan that has proven so successful in the modern ocean, could develop at sizes that are currently biologically impossible. The largest mantis shrimp of a high-oxygen ocean might not be measured in centimeters, but in meters. The predatory marine arthropods, which in the modern ocean are limited to relatively modest sizes by the oxygen constraints of gill respiration, could become apex predators at scales that are currently occupied only by vertebrates. This would create an interesting competitive dynamic between marine arthropods and marine vertebrates specifically, the fish and marine reptiles and mammals that currently dominate large animal ecological roles in the ocean. The outcome of that competition would depend on the specific capabilities of each group, which would themselves be altered by the high oxygen conditions. Fish, with their opercular gill system and higher metabolic rates, might also reach larger sizes and higher activity levels. The ocean in such a world would be a place of ecological competition at a scale that exceeds anything in the modern marine record. The chemistry of the deep-sea sediments in a well-oxygenated ocean would also be significantly different from what we find today. Modern deep-sea sediments are often reducing the low oxygen content of the deep water, means that the sediment's surface and the layers below it are anoxic, and organic matter accumulates in these sediments rather than being fully oxidized. This accumulation of organic matter in deep-sea sediments is actually a significant component of the global carbon cycle. It represents a burial of organic carbon that contributes to the maintenance of atmospheric oxygen. In a well-oxygenated deep ocean, the sediments would be more oxidizing. Organic matter reaching the seafloor would decompose more completely, releasing its carbon back to the water column rather than being buried. This would reduce the rate of deep-sea organic carbon burial, which would affect the carbon cycle and, eventually, the oxygen level of the atmosphere. It is another feedback. The well-oxygenated ocean consumes its own oxygen-producing advantage by allowing more efficient decomposition of buried organic carbon. The ocean of a 40% oxygen world is therefore not simply a more abundant place for life. It is a system under different chemical constraints, producing different patterns of productivity and carbon cycling, and supporting a different kind of ecological structure. Larger arthropods, better oxygenated deep water, more active benthic communities, and a carbon cycle that is running on a different budget than the one we know. The thermal structure of the ocean would also be affected by the changed atmosphere. A higher oxygen atmosphere interacts differently with incoming solar radiation and outgoing infrared radiation than the modern atmosphere does. The details of these radiative effects are complex and depend on the specific spectral properties of oxygen and its photochemical products, but the general tendency is toward an atmosphere that is slightly more opaque in certain wavelengths, which could affect both the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface and the efficiency with which the Earth radiates heat back into space. The consequence could be a warmer ocean surface, which would affect the density structure of the ocean and its circulation patterns. Warmer surface water is less dense, and therefore less likely to sink, which could weaken the thermohaline circulation and reduce the rate of deep water ventilation. This would partially counteract the benefit of the higher starting oxygen concentration. Slower circulation means longer transit times in the deep, which means more oxygen consumed before the water returns to the surface. The ocean of a 40% oxygen world is therefore not simply a modern ocean with more oxygen in it. It is a system running under different physical and chemical constraints, with different patterns of productivity, circulation, and nutrient availability. It is, in some respects, a more habitable system for complex marine life than the modern ocean, and in other respects, a more challenging one. The organisms that fill it would be products of millions of years of evolution in those different conditions, and they would bear only a partial resemblance to the marine fauna we know. The previous chapters have examined the immediate and medium-term consequences of doubled atmospheric oxygen. What happens to fire, to animal size, to the ocean? But a 40% oxygen world is not a static condition. It is a system in motion, and over geological time across millions and tens of millions of years, the changes introduced by high oxygen would propagate through the climate, the carbon cycle, and the geological processes that shape the planet's surface. Following those long-term consequences is difficult, because they involve feedbacks and interactions between systems that are themselves not perfectly understood. But the direction of the major effects can be traced, and what they suggest is a world that is not simply different from ours, but unstable in specific and interesting ways. A world that would be constantly working to return to a lower oxygen state, even as the processes driving the oxygen pulse continue to push it upward. The silicate weathering feedback is one of the most important long-term regulators of Earth's climate, and it would be significantly affected by the conditions of a 40% oxygen world in ways that deserve attention. The silicate weathering feedback works as follows. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in rainwater to form carbonic acid, which reacts with silicate rock at the surface, slowly dissolving it and releasing calcium and magnesium ions that eventually find their way to the ocean. In the ocean, these ions combine with carbonate ions to form calcium carbonate, which precipitates and is buried in seafloor sediments. This process removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a rate that depends on temperature. Warmer temperatures accelerate weathering, drawing down more carbon dioxide, which cools the climate, which slows weathering, which allows carbon dioxide to build back up. The result is a long-term thermostat that keeps Earth's climate within a habitable range over geological timescales. In a 40% oxygen world, several aspects of this feedback would be different. The higher oxygen concentration in the atmosphere would mean more reactive chemistry in the interaction between rainwater and rock, not just carbonic acid from dissolved carbon dioxide, but also sulfuric acid from the oxidation of sulfide minerals, which would accelerate rock weathering by an additional route. The rate of silicate weathering could be significantly enhanced relative to today. Faster silicate weathering means faster removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide. In the long run, this could produce a world with lower carbon dioxide concentration than the modern atmosphere, which would tend to cool the climate. A cooler climate would reduce weathering rates, creating a negative feedback that limits the cooling. But the equilibrium point of this feedback would be at a lower carbon dioxide concentration than today, meaning the climate of a high oxygen world could be cooler than the current world, particularly in mid and high latitudes. A cooler climate interacts with the fire ecology in complex ways. Cooler temperatures reduce evaporation, increasing soil moisture, which reduces fire frequency. But higher oxygen more than compensates for this effect. Even moist fuel ignites more readily at 40% oxygen than dry fuel does at 21%. The fire problem does not go away in a cooler climate. It is modulated by the moisture conditions, but its fundamental character, fire, as a near constant ecological force, is preserved by the chemistry of the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle would also be affected by the elevated oxygen of a high oxygen world. Nitrogen fixation, the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen gas into biologically useful forms, is performed primarily by certain bacteria and archaea, many of which are sensitive to oxygen concentration. Oxygen inhibits nitrogenase, the enzyme responsible for nitrogen fixation, and high oxygen environments tend to suppress biological nitrogen fixation. In a 40% oxygen atmosphere, the rate of biological nitrogen fixation could be significantly reduced, which would affect the availability of nitrogen as a nutrient for plant growth and the overall productivity of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. This reduction in nitrogen fixation could be partially offset by the increased availability of nitrogen from other sources, enhanced weathering of nitrogen-bearing minerals, for instance, or the effects of more frequent and more intense lightning in a more electrically active high-oxygen atmosphere. Lightning produces nitric oxide, which eventually combines with water to form nitric acid, providing a source of fixed nitrogen. A world with more frequent fire and more intense thunderstorms might have higher lightning-fixed nitrogen available to partially compensate for the reduction in biologically fixed nitrogen. The phosphorus cycle, which is another key nutrient cycle for terrestrial and marine ecosystems, would also be affected. Phosphorus is released from rock by weathering and is an essential nutrient for plant growth. The enhanced weathering rate of a high-oxygen world would increase the rate of phosphorus delivery from rock to soil and water, which would tend to increase productivity in phosphorus-limited ecosystems. This increased phosphorus availability would be a stimulant to plant growth and marine phytoplankton, partially offsetting the nitrogen fixation reduction and contributing to the high productivity that would be necessary to maintain the carbon burial rates required to keep oxygen at 40%. The interaction of all these long-term geochemical cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the silicate weathering feedback, would produce a world that is not simply our world with more oxygen. It is a world whose entire biogeochemical system has been reorganized around the constraint of higher oxygen, with every cycle running under different rates and equilibria, and the overall system finding a different long-term balance than the one we inhabit. The most important long-term pressure in a high-oxygen world is the fire feedback. As discussed in the chapter on fire, elevated oxygen dramatically increases the rate and intensity of combustion. This means that organic carbon that would otherwise be preserved in wood, in soil organic matter, and in peat is more rapidly converted back to carbon dioxide by fire. The carbon that was locked away from the atmosphere by plant growth is returned to the atmosphere before it can be buried and become coal or oil. This reduces the rate of net organic carbon burial, the very process that raised the oxygen in the first place. The fire feedback is therefore a negative feedback on the oxygen level, a self-correcting mechanism that tends to bring oxygen back down when it rises too high. The Earth's atmospheric oxygen has never remained above 35% for extended periods in the geological record, and the fire feedback is one of the main reasons why. At 40% oxygen, the fire feedback would be intense, and maintaining that oxygen level would require an extraordinary rate of organic carbon burial, an extraordinary rate of plant growth, death, and burial without decomposition. Whether that rate could be sustained depends on conditions that are not simple to specify. If the world had the right combination of geography, large, warm, shallow continental shelves for marine organic burial, extensive tropical swamps for terrestrial coal formation, limited oxygen exposure during the burial process, the oxygen level might be maintained. If those conditions were absent or weakened, the fire feedback would win, and the oxygen would decline toward a lower equilibrium. This tension between the processes that drive oxygen up and the processes that drive it back down is one of the central dynamics of Earth's atmospheric history. The Carboniferous oxygen pulse was resolved when the rise of lignin-decomposing fungi and the changing climate of the late Carboniferous reduced the rate of organic carbon burial. The oxygen that had accumulated over tens of millions of years began to decline, and the great diversity of Carboniferous high-oxygen adaptations, the giant insects, the fire-adapted plant communities came under pressure. In a hypothetical 40% oxygen world, the same dynamics would eventually operate. The world would not remain at 40% indefinitely. It would seek a lower equilibrium, driven by the fire feedback and by the other geochemical processes that consume oxygen. The question is not whether the oxygen would eventually come down, but how long the high oxygen state would persist, and what the world would look like during that interval. The climate of a high oxygen world would also be affected by changes to the carbon cycle that operate on geological timescales. Higher oxygen means lower atmospheric carbon dioxide in many scenarios, because the same processes that produce oxygen from carbon dioxide, if operating more intensely, also draw down carbon dioxide. Lower carbon dioxide means a weaker greenhouse effect and, potentially, a cooler climate. But the relationship between oxygen, carbon dioxide, and climate is not linear, and the details depend on the rate of volcanism, the configuration of the continents, the chemistry of the ocean, and a range of other factors that vary over geological time. What can be said with some confidence is that the carbon cycle of a 40% oxygen world would be running differently from the modern carbon cycle, with different rates of photosynthesis, different rates of decomposition and fire, and different patterns of ocean atmosphere carbon exchange. The climate would be different, and the nature of the difference is not easy to predict with precision. One effect that is more tractable is the impact of elevated oxygen on rock weathering. Oxygen is a participant in many weathering reactions. It oxidizes sulfide minerals in exposed rock, releasing sulfuric acid that accelerates the dissolution of carbonate and silicate minerals. At higher oxygen concentrations, these weathering reactions would proceed faster, increasing the rate of nutrient delivery to rivers and oceans, which would affect marine productivity. It would also increase the rate at which certain types of rock are chemically broken down, which could affect the stability of soils and the chemistry of freshwater systems. The soil chemistry of a high-oxygen world is another area of significant change. Soils are complex chemical systems in which the redox environment, the balance between oxidizing and reducing conditions, strongly influences nutrient availability, microbial community composition, and the rate of organic matter decomposition. In a higher oxygen atmosphere, the upper layers of soil would be more strongly oxidizing, which would accelerate the decomposition of organic matter and reduce the accumulation of soil carbon. This would have implications for plant nutrition and for the long-term accumulation of carbon in terrestrial ecosystems. The long-term pressure of 40% oxygen on the Earth system is therefore not simply one thing. It is a collection of interacting pressures on fire frequency, on carbon burial, on climate, on weathering, on soil chemistry that would collectively reshape the planet's surface over millions of years in ways that compound and interact in complex ways. The world at 40% oxygen would not be in a stable state. It would be in a dynamic tension between the forces that raise the oxygen and the forces that would eventually bring it back down, and the landscape of that tension would be unlike anything Earth has experienced in the Phanerozoic record. The world at 40% oxygen never existed. The Carboniferous reached 30 to 35% and was pulled back, first slowly by the spread of lignin-digesting fungi, and eventually more rapidly by the changing conditions of the Permian. The climate cooled. The great swamp forests retreated and fragmented. The oxygen pulse ended. By the time of the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, at the Permian-Triassic boundary approximately 252 million years ago, the oxygen content of the atmosphere had fallen dramatically, possibly to as low as 15%, and the great biological experiment of the Carboniferous high was over. The world we imagine tonight is the world that would have required the Carboniferous conditions to persist longer and climb higher. A world where the climate stayed warm and humid enough for the great swamp forests to continue growing, where the lignin decomposers failed to arrive on schedule, and where the geological conditions for organic carbon burial remained favorable for tens of millions of additional years. It is a world that was possible in the sense that no law of physics prevented it, but that did not happen because the specific contingencies of Carboniferous Earth resolved in a different direction. This matters for how we think about the high-oxygen world's nature. It was not simply a bigger, more dramatic version of the modern Earth. It was a world that never had the chance to fully work out its own ecology, to develop the fire-adapted plant communities that would have been required to evolve the gigantic arthropods to their fullest possible scale, to build the deep-sea ecosystems that well-oxygenated deep water would eventually have supported. The world at 40% oxygen is, in a sense, a world that would have taken millions of years of evolution to fully inhabit. What we can describe is not a finished world, but a world in the process of becoming one where the rules had changed and life was in the middle of responding. That incompleteness is part of what makes the thought experiment interesting. We are not imagining a world that has found its equilibrium. We are imagining a world mid-transformation, with all the stress and opportunity that implies. Consider what such a world offers to the organisms capable of adapting to it. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous were not simply scaled-up versions of their smaller ancestors. They were ecologically dominant in ways that small arthropods are not. A Meganeura dragonfly at 70-centimeter wingspan could capture prey that would be invulnerable to its smaller relatives. An Arthropleura at 2.5 meters was, for its time, one of the largest herbivores in any terrestrial ecosystem, an organism that could consume vegetation at a scale that nothing in the modern invertebrate world can match. At 40% oxygen, these organisms would not be the giants of their time. They would be the predecessors of even larger and more ecologically dominant forms, organisms that had had additional millions of years to explore the possibilities that high oxygen opened. The ecology of a fully developed 40% oxygen world would be, in many respects, an ecology of the large. Not exclusively small organisms would still fill essential roles, and the metabolic advantages of small size are not erased by higher oxygen. But the relative dominance of large forms in the ecosystem would be greater than in any period in Earth's history. The landscape would be structured by organisms whose scale we can barely picture from the fossil record arthropods that are not curiosities of a brief geological period, but dominant life forms that have had time to fully colonize the ecological space their size makes available. The fire ecology of such a world would also be more developed than anything the Carboniferous produced. The Carboniferous high oxygen period was brief enough, geologically, that plant communities had limited time to fully evolve fire-adapted strategies. A world that had maintained high oxygen for tens of millions of years would have plant communities that were not partially adapted to fire but thoroughly and profoundly fire-adapted communities that were, in a real sense, designed around fire as an organizing principle. The structure of forests, the composition of plant communities, the seasonal rhythms of growth and dieback and fire and regrowth, all of it would have been shaped by the assumption that fire was not an episodic event, but a structural feature of the environment. And the ocean, given sufficient time, would have reorganized itself around the deeper oxygenation that a 40% oxygen atmosphere provides. The deep-sea ecosystems that would eventually develop in a well-oxygenated ocean are almost impossible to predict. In detail, we have no modern equivalent and only a limited fossil record from the brief intervals in Earth's past, when deep water was better oxygenated than usual. What we can say is that the volume of the ocean is enormous, and that the organisms that evolved to exploit a fully oxygenated deep ocean would represent an entirely new radiation of marine life, one of the great expansions of ecological space in the history of complex life. The world that wasn't is, in many ways, a more dramatic world than the one that was. More fire, more size, more ecological possibility in the deep ocean. But it is also a more precarious world, one running on a high oxygen level that Earth's geochemical systems are continuously working to reduce, where the stability of the atmospheric condition that makes everything else possible is always contingent on maintaining the extraordinary rate of organic carbon burial that produced it. The air we breathe, the 21% oxygen that feels like a background condition of existence, is itself a contingent thing. It is the product of hundreds of millions of years of negotiations between photosynthesis and decomposition, between organic carbon burial and fire, between the living world and the geological processes that shape the chemistry of the planet. The number could have been higher. In a different history, following from slightly different conditions in the Carboniferous, it might have been. The world in that case would have been unlike anything we know, a world shaped by an air that is richer, hotter burning, and more consequential than the quiet, familiar air we breathe as we fall asleep. That world was not, but it was almost. There's a philosophical dimension to the question of the world that wasn't, and it is worth sitting with before we close. The contingency of Earth's oxygen level is, in one reading, a reminder that the specific form of life we know, the particular organisms, the particular ecology, the particular chemistry is not the only form of life that the laws of physics and chemistry would permit. There are other worlds with other atmospheres that would support life of a different kind. Not all of those worlds are better than this one. Not all are worse. They are simply different expressions of the same underlying principles in different chemical environments. The 40% oxygen world, if it had developed fully, would have been as real to its inhabitants as this world is to us. The giant arthropods navigating the fire-interrupted forest would not have found their world strange. It would simply have been the world. The fish in the well-oxygenated deep ocean would not have known any other kind of ocean. The organisms breathing air with twice our oxygen would not have experienced that air as rich or overwhelming. It would have been normal air, the only air they knew. This is one of the more quiet revelations of speculative paleoecology. The parameters that we take as given, the oxygen level, the atmospheric pressure, the ocean chemistry, the fire frequency, are not given in any fundamental sense. They are the current output of a system that has been running for billions of years and will continue running long after the particular arrangements that produced us have changed. The world we inhabit is one instance of what Earth chemistry produces. It is real and present and detailed in a way that no speculative world can be, but it is not uniquely the right instance. There is something calming about this, if it is held correctly. The enormous effort the planet makes, the billions of years of chemistry and geology and biology working in concert to produce the specific air and water and stone that we inhabit, is the same kind of effort it would have made for a world at 40% oxygen, or 15%, or any other viable concentration. The planet does not prefer our oxygen level. It arrived here, and it will move on from here, driven by the same processes that have been moving it since long before anything breathed. The question of what the world might have been is ultimately a question about the range of the possible. It is a way of taking the measure of what chemistry and physics and biology can produce in different configurations. The high oxygen world is one configuration that was almost reached and then stepped back from. The Permian extinction followed, and the world was reorganized at lower oxygen, and the vertebrate lineage that eventually produced. The creatures reading this had its particular path shaped by those conditions, rather than by the high oxygen conditions that almost prevailed. We are, in some sense, the product of the world that chose not to be the 40% world. The path that was taken led here to this particular set of organisms, this particular ecology, this particular chemistry of the air. The path not taken would have led to a different here, with different organisms, different ecology, different chemistry. Both are real possibilities. Only one was expressed. And the one that was expressed, with its 21% oxygen and its manageable fires and its insects of ordinary size, is the world in which we now breathe and think and sleep. The air in the room is what it is. That is enough. The air in this room contains approximately 21 molecules of oxygen for every 100 molecules of total gas. That number is not arbitrary. It is the product of 500 million years of chemistry, biology, and geology working in concert, adjusting and readjusting across mass extinctions and evolutionary radiations and the slow movement of continents through a warming and cooling climate. It landed on 21% because of the specific balance of forces operating on this specific planet at this specific moment in its history. There is no physical law requiring it to be 21. The record shows it has been 15, it has been 35. The range of possible Earths, in terms of atmospheric oxygen alone, is considerably wider than the single data point we inhabit. What is not recorded, what has never been expressed, is the world at 40%. The world where the Carboniferous pulse climbed higher and stayed longer. The world where the giant arthropods had more time and more oxygen to become what they were moving toward. The world where the deep ocean opened fully to complex life, and the forest floor was a perpetual stage for fire, and the air itself was an animal's most abundant resource. That world lies in the space between what happened and what the chemistry allowed. It is not in the fossil record, because the fossil record is the record of what happened. It is in the space of what could have been, which is a different kind of record, one written not in stone but in the internal logic of physical systems, in the equations that govern combustion and diffusion and atmospheric chemistry. The Earth that we know emerged from a series of contingencies. The oxygen level is one of those contingencies. The world at 21% is not better or worse than the world at 40, it is simply what occurred, given the particular combination of geological, biological, and astronomical conditions that prevailed at each moment. A different combination, and the air would be different, and the world that breathes it would be different, and the creatures that fall asleep in it would be different too. We breathe 21%. For now, and for the foreseeable geological future, that is what the negotiation has settled on. There is something in the thought of the high oxygen world that is specifically related to the imagination of alternatives to the recognition that what is not the only thing that could have been. This is a perspective that deep time uniquely enables. When you look at the world through the lens of hundreds of millions of years of Earth history, the current arrangement of things reveals itself as one outcome among many possible outcomes, all equally physical, all equally consistent with the laws of nature, but only one of which is expressed in the matter and energy of the actual world. The oxygen level at which we exist is not the oxygen level at which we must exist. The planet does not owe us 21%. It arrived here through a specific sequence of biological and geological events, and it will move on from here through the continuation of those same processes. The oxygen that feels like a fixed background to our experience is in motion slowly, on timescales that make our individual lives seem like moments always in negotiation between the forces that produce it and the forces that consume it. To know this is not alarming. It is simply accurate. The world is a dynamic system, always in motion, always producing consequences from prior causes, always setting up the conditions for what comes next. The 21% oxygen that fills the room tonight is the current output of that system, a momentary reading of a number that has been different before and will be different again, long after the particular arrangements of matter that are reading this have dissolved back into the cycle. For now, it is enough. The relationship between oxygen and carbon dioxide is not simply that one is the product of photosynthesis and the other is the reactant. They are linked through the carbon cycle in a way that means changes in one necessarily affect the other. When photosynthesis extracts carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releases oxygen, it does so at a ratio of 1 molecule of carbon dioxide consumed for every molecule of oxygen produced. When respiration or combustion reverses this process, the ratio is reversed. The atmosphere is therefore caught between these two processes, with the balance point, the oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations that prevail at any given time determined by which process dominates in the net. In a world where organic carbon burial is occurring at the high rate required to maintain 40% oxygen, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere would be substantially lower than today's. Every ton of organic carbon buried in sediment without decomposing represents 1 ton of carbon removed from the atmospheric carbon cycle and 1 corresponding release of oxygen. If this process is running fast enough to drive oxygen to 40%, it is also running fast enough to strip a significant amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Lower atmospheric carbon dioxide has consequences for plant physiology, because carbon dioxide is the raw material for photosynthesis. Plants that evolved in our current atmosphere with carbon dioxide concentrations that, while varying, have generally remained in a range that plants can exploit relatively efficiently, are tuned to that range. At substantially lower carbon dioxide concentrations, the efficiency of photosynthesis decreases. Plants must open their stomata wider to take in sufficient carbon dioxide, which increases water loss through transpiration. The trade-off between carbon fixation and water conservation becomes more challenging. This is a constraint that high-oxygen plants would have had millions of years to evolve around, developing more efficient photosynthetic biochemistry, or different stomatal strategies, or alternative carbon-concentrating mechanisms, but it is a real constraint that shapes the character of plant life in a high-oxygen, low-carbon dioxide world. The vegetation of such a world would not simply be fire-adapted versions of modern plants. It would be plants whose photosynthetic machinery had been tuned by millions of years of selection under different gas concentrations, potentially quite different in biochemistry from anything alive today. The lycopsid trees of the Carboniferous Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, the dominant forms were structurally very different from modern trees, in ways that matter for understanding the high oxygen pulse they produced. Modern trees are supported by wood secondary xylem, a dense mass of cellulose and lignin that forms the trunk and allows the tree to grow tall and branch extensively over many decades or centuries. Lycopsid trees, by contrast, grew extremely rapidly and were supported primarily by their bark, a thick, photosynthetically active outer layer that was the main structural element of the trunk. This bark-first architecture had an interesting consequence for organic carbon burial. When a lycopsid tree died, its bark, the main structural component, was extremely resistant to decomposition, not because of lignin in the way that modern wood is resistant, but because of a different suite of resistant compounds. The lignin-decomposing fungi that would eventually bring down the carbon burial rate of the Carboniferous were specifically adapted to the wood of later tree lineages, and the lycopsid bark presented a different chemical challenge that those fungi were even slower to solve. The result was that Carboniferous forests produced dead plant material with an extraordinary resistance to decomposition material that accumulated in the swamps and peat beds that eventually became coal at rates that have never been matched before or since. The coal seams that power modern industry are the literal remains of this bacterial and fungal failure to decompose the Carboniferous forest, a geological monument to the slowness of decomposition during a specific, brief interval of Earth history. In a world where this interval had continued longer and the oxygen pulse had climbed higher, the coal deposits that would eventually form would have been even more extensive. The burial of organic carbon that characterizes the Carboniferous would have extended for additional tens of millions of years, producing a geological record of organic burial and of atmospheric oxygen that would have been visible to any future civilization able to read it. The coal seams of that alternate world would have been thicker, more widespread, and higher in total carbon than anything in our geological record. The food web structure of the high oxygen ocean would be significantly different from the modern marine food web in ways that go beyond the size of individual organisms. The modern ocean's food web is organized around phytoplankton microscopic photosynthetic organisms that fix carbon in the surface waters and form the base of most marine food chains. The efficiency with which energy moves from phytoplankton up through the food web, from zooplankton to small fish to large fish to apex predators, is limited in part by the metabolic costs of each trophic level, which are partly determined by oxygen availability. In a high oxygen ocean, the metabolic costs of maintaining and operating a body of a given size are lower, because the aerobic metabolism that sustains activity is running more efficiently. The fraction of energy obtained by eating that can be invested in growth rather than respiration is higher. This means that the efficiency of energy transfer up the food chain is somewhat improved in a high-oxygen ocean. More of the energy fixed by phytoplankton eventually makes it to the top predators, rather than being lost as heat at each trophic transfer. The practical consequence is a food web that is more productive at the upper levels relative to the base one, where the apex predators are more abundant relative to the primary producers than in the modern ocean. This is a subtle effect, and it is partially counteracted by the reduced surface productivity in iron-limited regions. But in regions where nutrients are not limiting, the high-oxygen ocean would support denser populations of large predators than an equivalent modern ocean, because the energy ladder from phytoplankton to apex predator is more efficient. The behavior of these large predators would also be different. Modern large marine predators, sharks, toothed whales, large tuna, are constrained in their activity levels by the metabolic cost of sustained high-speed swimming, which is energetically expensive. In a high-oxygen ocean, the oxygen available to sustain aerobic muscle activity is more abundant, and the recovery time from intense exertion is shorter. Large predators in this ocean could sustain higher pursuit speeds for longer periods, which would affect the evolutionary arms race between predator and prey selecting for faster prey fish, which would in turn select for faster predators, driving an escalation of swimming speeds and maneuverability that the modern ocean's energy budget cannot sustain. The relationship between oxygen and atmospheric electricity is an underappreciated aspect of the high-oxygen world thought experiment. Lightning is produced by the electrical discharge between regions of opposite charge within thunderstorms or between clouds and the ground. The frequency of lightning is influenced by the convective energy of the atmosphere, the vigor of updrafts and downdrafts that separate electrical charges in storm clouds, and by the conductivity of the atmosphere, which is in turn influenced by its chemical composition. In a high-oxygen atmosphere, the chemistry of the lower atmosphere is different in ways that affect its electrical properties. Oxygen and its photochemical derivatives, ozone, hydroxyl radicals, and other reactive species influence the ionic composition of the air and therefore its electrical conductivity. The specific effects are complex and depend on details of the atmospheric composition that are difficult to specify precisely for a hypothetical high-oxygen world. But the general tendency of a more chemically reactive atmosphere is toward different patterns of charge separation and discharge in thunderstorms. More importantly for the ecological consequences, a high-oxygen atmosphere supports more intense combustion when lightning does ignite a fire. The same lightning strike that in the modern world might produce a small fire quickly extinguished by moisture would, in a 40% oxygen world, produce a larger, hotter, more persistent fire with a higher probability of spreading into the surrounding vegetation. This multiplier effect on lightning-ignited fires is one of the most direct ways that elevated oxygen translates into elevated fire frequency. Each lightning strike has a higher expected fire output in a high-oxygen atmosphere than in a modern one. The biological significance of lightning in a high-oxygen world is therefore not just about its role as a fire igniter. It is about the ecological processing of lightning, the conversion of atmospheric electrical energy into ecological reorganization in the form of fire-created habitat structure. A world where each lightning strike has a higher probability of producing an ecologically significant fire is a world where the energy of thunderstorms has a more pronounced ecological footprint than in the modern world. The atmosphere and the land surface are more tightly connected through the medium of fire, with energy flowing from storm to landscape more efficiently and with more consistent ecological consequences. The question of what a high-oxygen world smells like is rarely asked in speculative science discussions, but it is worth a moment. Fire produces a complex chemical signature in the air. Volatile organic compounds from burning wood and vegetation, carbon particles, nitrogen oxides, and a range of other combustion products. In a world where fires are more frequent and more extensive, These compounds would be present in the lower atmosphere at higher concentrations, more persistently, and over larger geographic areas. The baseline odor of a high-oxygen world, what the air smells like when you simply stand in it, far from any visible fire, would carry the chemical residue of recent combustion in a way that the modern atmosphere does not, except in fire-prone regions during active fire seasons. This is a small detail, but it illustrates something important about the texture of the high-oxygen world. It is not simply a world that is quantitatively more intense than ours. It is a world with a different sensory character, different sounds, different chemistry on the tongue and in the lungs, different visual quality of the air, where fire-produced haze is more persistent. The organisms that evolved in this world would not experience it as overwhelming or strange. They would be calibrated to it, their senses tuned to detect the signals that mattered in their environment, their chemistry adapted to process the air that surrounded them. But a visitor from our world, if such a transfer were possible, would find the air of the high-oxygen world recognizable in the most basic physical properties and alien in almost everything else. The question of what happens to human physiology in a 40% oxygen atmosphere at normal pressure has been studied in the context of hyperbaric oxygen therapy treatments that expose patients to elevated oxygen concentrations for therapeutic purposes. At 100% oxygen at normal atmospheric pressure, pulmonary oxygen toxicity damage to the lung lining begins within hours to days. At 40% oxygen, the risk is much lower but not absent with prolonged exposure. Individuals vary in their susceptibility. The most sensitive effect is oxidative stress at the cellular level, the accumulation of reactive oxygen species that damage proteins, lipids, and DNA faster than cellular repair mechanisms can keep up. What this tells us about the organisms of a high-oxygen world is that the antioxidant systems of those organisms would need to be substantially more robust than those of modern organisms. The cellular machinery for neutralizing reactive oxygen species, the superoxide dismutases, catalases, glutathione peroxidases, and other antioxidant enzymes would be under stronger selective pressure in a high-oxygen world. And the organisms that survived and thrived would have more elaborate defenses against oxidative damage. This would not be unique to animals. Plants, fungi, and microorganisms in a high-oxygen world would all face higher oxidative stress and would all have evolved more robust antioxidant strategies. This is one of the ways in which the biology of a high-oxygen world would be genuinely different at the molecular level from the biology of the modern world, not just scaled up, but chemically restructured at the subcellular scale to manage a more reactive chemical environment. The proteins and lipids and nucleic acids of high-oxygen life would be surrounded by different concentrations of reactive species, protected by different arrays of antioxidant enzymes, and repaired by different rates and mechanisms of molecular maintenance. Life at 40% oxygen is life running a different molecular economy than the life we know. The ocean surface in a 40% oxygen world would also interact differently with the atmosphere than it does today. The surface ocean exchanges gases with the atmosphere, continuously absorbing carbon dioxide when the atmospheric partial pressure exceeds the dissolved concentration, releasing it when the opposite is true, and doing the same for oxygen and other gases. In a high oxygen atmosphere, the partial pressure of oxygen at the sea surface would be roughly double the modern value, driving more oxygen into the surface water. The chemistry of the surface ocean, its oxidation state, its ion chemistry, its biological productivity, would reflect this higher dissolved oxygen at every level. The organisms living at the ocean's surface would be exposed to this more oxidizing environment and would show similar adaptations to the terrestrial organisms' more robust antioxidant systems, biochemistry calibrated for a more reactive chemical environment. The marine equivalent of the high-oxygen world's biology would be just as molecularly distinct from modern marine life as the terrestrial equivalent. even though the visual and ecological differences would be expressed differently. One aspect of the high oxygen ocean that is easy to overlook is its color. The color of the ocean depends on the way light interacts with the water itself and with the particles dissolved or suspended in it: phytoplankton, sediment, dissolved organic matter. At higher oxygen concentrations, the optical properties of seawater change slightly, and the biological productivity of the surface ocean changes, which affects the concentration and composition of the phytoplankton that give the ocean its characteristic blue-green color. A high oxygen ocean might appear subtly different from a modern ocean when viewed from above, not dramatically different, but with a different distribution of bloom colors, different seasonal patterns of surface color change, and potentially a different background color in the clear, low productivity regions where the color is determined primarily by the water itself. These are small details in the context of a thought experiment about fundamental changes to the atmosphere, but they illustrate the pervasive nature of the change every scale, from the molecular to the visual, from the cellular to the continental, reflects the single alteration of the oxygen level, amplified and propagated through every system that the atmosphere touches. What happens in the days and weeks after a fire in a high-oxygen world is worth imagining in some detail because it reveals something about the ecological rhythm of that world, the pulse of destruction and renewal that would be the defining beat of terrestrial life. In the modern world, a forest fire leaves a landscape that is initially stark, blackened trunks, ash-covered soil, the absence of the canopy that previously organized the ecosystem. But within days, the first signs of recovery begin. Seeds that survived in the soil germinate. Buried tubers and root crowns of fire-adapted plants begin sending up new shoots. Insects return to exploit the flush of nutrients released by the ash. Birds follow the insects. Within years, a fire-cleared landscape is returning to a dense vegetation cover, and within decades, the pre-fire forest structure can be largely re-established. In a high-oxygen world, this recovery pulse would be faster and more intense. The higher oxygen available for photosynthesis combined with the nutrient release from ash and the absence of competition from established vegetation would drive extremely rapid plant growth in the post-fire landscape. The first colonizers would be organisms that had evolved specifically to exploit this window, fast-growing, early successional species with deep root systems that could access the newly released nutrients quickly and grow above the competition before slower-growing species could establish. The ecological diversity of the post-fire landscape would be high. The removal of established vegetation creates a mosaic of opportunity. Different microhabitats in the burned area offer different resources and support different species. Animals that had retreated from the fire zone would return in waves, each species tracking the succession of plant communities as they developed. The early post-fire colonists would attract one suite of animals, the later successional plants would attract another, and the full ecological community of the landscape would reassemble over a period of years to decades, until the next fire reset the process. In a world where fire is frequent and widespread, this cycle of fire, recovery, and refire would be the organizing rhythm of most terrestrial ecosystems. The landscape at any given time would be a patchwork of fire ages, recently burned zones, mid-recovery areas, and mature vegetation approaching the density that would again make it highly flammable. The animals that inhabited this landscape would have evolved behavioral and physiological strategies for navigating a world in constant flux where the conditions in any given location change dramatically on a timescale of years to decades. This is not a chaotic world. It is a world with a very regular rhythm, more regular, in some respects, than the modern world, where fire seasons are variable and large fires episodic. In a high-oxygen world, fire would be as predictable as seasons, not in its exact timing or location, but in its inevitability. The organisms that lived in this world would have internalized that inevitability as completely as modern organisms have internalized the alternation of day and night. Fire would be woven into the behavioral repertoire, the reproductive strategy, the morphology and physiology of every organism that lived on land, the world would breathe differently for it. Not with alarm, with the deep familiarity of creatures at home and the conditions that shaped them.